are 16 parties in conference, including you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. Today's talk is entitled The Role of Statistics in Today's Changing Society, the 2020 Census. And today's talk is sponsored by a couple of groups, the Washington Statistical Society, WSS Education Committee, the WSS Methodology Section, the Data Methods Collection, and the Washington-Baltimore chapter of the Public Opinion Research, or DC-84. So I have a couple of items, mostly for folks in the room to take care of before we get started. If you haven't signed up or signed in when you came in, please do so, and please leave your email address for us. And if anyone in the room is not an ASA or WSS member, we do encourage you to consider joining. There's some materials in the lobby to help you with that. We'd also like to thank BLS for letting us use this room today. Following today's talk, we'll have an informal reception just across the street at the East Street Cafe. So you're welcome to join us. Food and beverage are available for purchase. It's pretty easy to get to. Feel free to follow me afterwards if you need any help. And then for the structure of today's talk, we'll have two speakers joining us, providing the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. Questions. So then. All right, so we have two ladies who will be speaking today, Marisa and Julia. So Marisa is the chief of the Content and Language Branch of the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Content and Language Branch manages the content of the 2020 census, questionnaires, and associated non-questionnaire materials, and they identify ways to reduce language barriers for limited English-speaking households. Marisa previously worked as a survey statistician supporting the American Community Survey data users and as an analyst of the Census Bureau's Industry and Occupation Statistics branch. She has a bachelor's degree in economics and Spanish, a master's degree in public management, a master's certificate in project management, and she's CMP certification. Julia is the chief of the Census Experiments branch at the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Census Experiments branch is responsible for conducting research and experimentation on topics aimed at informing the science of the decennial census. Julia previously worked with paradata from ongoing surveys conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau to improve field practices, and she monitored and analyzed data from the coverage follow-up operation during the 2010 census that aimed to add missed people or delete erroneously counted people. She has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and English literature from the University of Miami, a master's in survey methodology from JPSM, and a master's certification in project management. So thank you very much for joining us, and we're very excited to hear your presentation today. Make sure this microphone works for everybody on the phone, too. Try to be loud, just in case. I don't know if people will let you know.
Just speak louder.
Okay. All right. So thank you for the kind introduction. It's definitely our pleasure to be here today to talk about the 2020 census. And all of the innovations that we've implemented and the processes and programs that we've established to prepare for the 2020 census. Since 1790, a census of the U.S. population has been conducted every 10 years, as required by the U.S. Constitution. And 1 year from today is actually Census Day for the census. So hopefully our talk will motivate you to be an early responder or potentially to apply for one of the thousands of opportunities to assist with this effort. So census data per kind of this theme, the role of statistics in changing society, obviously have a huge statistical role in our society. After all, the Census Bureau's mission is to serve as the nation's leading provider of quality data about its people and economy. But the 2020 census is also an undertaking that's designed, conducted, and informed by statistics. So before we get started, making sure everybody has the same general understanding of what the 2020 census is. The purpose of the census is to conduct an enumeration of population and housing and disseminate the results to the President, the states, and the American people. And this is as mandated by Article 1 of Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And obviously the primary purpose is to apportion representation among the states in the House of Representatives. And we'll have a fun video in a second if you haven't seen it. It's a little bit old, so hopefully it's new for some folks. But the many other important uses of census data include drawing congressional and state legislative districts, school districts, and voting precincts, distributing more than $675 billion annually.
Mute on. Mute off.
Turn the volume up on this too. See how it goes here.
The mandate for the census is right here. Just think of the formula as an apportioning machine. First, the Constitution calls for each of the 50 states to have at least one seat. So subtract 50 from the current House total of 435, and you have 385 seats left. Next, the apportionment machine ranks the states by according to the census. Then the machine starts giving out seats. After each seat is distributed, the machine re-ranks the remaining states based on the formula. The all seats are distributed. This process ensures that each congressional district from Maryland to California has roughly the same number of people. In 1790, each House member represented only about 34,000 people. In 2000, each member represented on average 647,000 people. Since the first census, the decennial count has been the basis for our representative form of government. And as our country grows, the apportionment process ensures equal representation for all, just what the founding fathers planned. Apportionment, another gift from our nation's founders, who transformed the census from a tool of government to a tool of empowerment for the people.
Okay, so hopefully that was reasonably loud enough for at least everybody on the phone, but it is on our website just in case it was quiet or otherwise hard with a lag there. So that's the main use of decennial census data. Obviously,
The U.S. Census is generally considered more technical and controversial. But in recent months, the once-a-decade
Okay.
Yeah, try that again. Okay. So obviously a very important use.
It should be. Here you go. Good.
All right. So obviously, very important use is the apportionment data. Another huge use of 2020 census data will be to distribute federal funding. So we know from an analysis of fiscal year 2015 data, that is, that federal programs use Census Bureau data in whole or in part to distribute more than $675 in data annually.
Hi, I just asked you.
Census Bureau data for the scope of this analysis include both decennial census data, program data, which would be your data, survey data, and geographical programs. Those data from those related programs that also use decennial census data as a critical input.
Wow. So very quick.
So federal programs use census
together for many years. So.
Congratulations.
We finally made the decision.
All right.
Yes, yes.
Good.
Thank you,
Good.
thank you. And thank you for the email. I'm incorporating right now.
Okay, no, I want to get back a little bit in the cycle and see if I can help. Not the printing.
Thank you.
But you've done a lot on the project, and
Yeah.
when I haven't had a lot of time
I
either.
hope
So.
it's good.
Yeah, I think so. No, you know things I don't, and so I'll, like I say, I need to look, even review what I've done, and then see if I can do a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the simulation studies will tell us something, and definitely will be a good check on also on the LCJ trials.
areas, so like incorporated areas with a population of 50,000 or more. It's also part of the allocation formula. Other federal programs use additional social, demographic, economic, or housing characteristics, sometimes along with the population data itself, to allocate funds. So an example would be, further restricting it, like number of children between the ages of 5 and 17.
Thank you so much.
Other federal programs use derived. So all of your per capita variables are good examples of this, like per capita income, like federal medical assistance percentage. The FMAP is a good example that uses per capita income for their allocation. And then other programs use the geographic area data, so the delineation of geographic areas that follows the 2020 census to allocate funds. So good examples of this are kind of that urban and rural distinction that's made after a decennial census, and that's used in a lot of U.S. Department of Agriculture funding. So just kind of some general examples of how Census Bureau data are used. And then on this next slide, a couple specific program examples. These are from the fiscal year 2015 data, the 20 largest federal assistance programs that were using Census Bureau data at that time. So as you can see, it's healthcare, it's food assistance, education, highway construction, disaster recovery grants that really kind of spans a lot of the federal sector. So those examples. And then in addition to the federal uses, there are a lot of countless local uses as well. So school districts will use census data about the families and children in their area to make kind of long-term building and staffing decisions. Census data help a lot of communities and organizations reach out to their populations of interest and encourage them to apply for federal programs for which they're eligible. And the organizations themselves sometimes apply for grants and other federal programs. And then, of course, businesses use census data to plan new sites for their warehouses, factories, storefronts, and sometimes to recruit workforce. So while the Census Bureau data inform the public about population change and they help federal programs respond to those changes, the decennial itself also has to respond to a changing environment every 10 years. So for the 2020 census, we have changing use of technology, declining response rates, complex living arrangements, mobile populations, and along with a lot of other factors, they can lead to an environment where the population is harder and potentially expensive to enumerate. So we have a series of challenges for the 2020 census, and these dark blue circles on the slide, including response rates for surveys and censuses all over the world are declining. People are concerned about sharing information, and trust in government is declining. Households are more complex, diverse, dynamic. Blended families include children who may have two primary residences. Other households may include more than one family or multiple generations. We're a highly mobile nation, and about 15% of the population moves in any given year. And more households speak languages other than English. So you add all of those together, and then you also consider that in 2020 we're competing for attention with both the Olympics and a presidential election. So that leads to 2020 census being a really rapidly changing environment. Around the time of the next census, we're counting somewhere around 330 million people living in about 140 million housing units. So how do we achieve this tremendous goal of counting everyone once, only once, and in the right place? Julia can take over and tell you a little about our plan.
Thanks, Marisa. So I'm going to walk through some very high-level points on what the design of the 2020 census is. And I just want to note that if you don't get to hear the thing that you really want to hear about and you don't ask a question or you don't feel like you got the right answer, or you got a sufficient answer, the operational plan, the final operational plan is out there on the website, and you're welcome to download it. It has lots of details of exactly what we're planning to do. It came out a couple of months ago. So this slide provides a snapshot of how we conduct the census. We've done a lot to ensure that we're making it easier for people to respond to the census. Like Marisa said, the goal of the census is to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. That can be very challenging because everybody laid out all the challenges. Each one of those things are challenging. Everyone once, and then only once, and then also that you're where you should be. So the first step of that is building the address list. It includes every address in the country, and it forms the basis of the census, because the census is not only of people, but of housing. Then we need to motivate people to respond. Partners play a key role here, and people need to know how important it is to respond to the census. And so we really need our partners to get that word out. Then once we've motivated them, they have to actually respond. We've made self-response easier than ever, and we're highlighting 3 modes this time in multiple languages that people can self-respond. As in prior censuses, We also make sure to enumerate people who are living or staying in non-traditional housing, which we call group quarters. So there's also an opportunity for the people experiencing homelessness to be included in the census. We have to think how we reach those people. And still, some people will not respond, so we follow up with them, usually by knocking on their door. Partners are really helpful here as well, because they encourage people to cooperate with us to come to their house. And then the big release, we tabulate and release the census results first to the president and then to the rest of the country. So I'm going to go through each one of those pieces in a little more depth, and what questions and answers we'll also get to maybe what you're interested in. So first, we establish where to count. So we have to identify all the addresses where people could live. So we conduct a 100% review and update of the nation's address list, and we're going to be using tablets and laptops to verify the addresses in the field, whereas before we had paper lists of addresses. And we're building on the use of handheld devices for listing. That's what we did last. So using geospatial imagery, we've been able to verify about 70% of addresses from our data center, instead of verifying them all in the field by walking every street in the nation. So we have 11.2 million census blocks. That's a lot. They did walk all of those census blocks in 2010. So one of the innovations that we've done in the engineering address canvassing is reducing that burden or that workload of in-field verification. So we're using multiple data sources to identify areas with lots of address changes, like postal sequence delivery files, and we get local government input through a program we have called the Local Update of Census Addresses program. So far, we've received responses from governments which represent 95% of the housing units in the United States through this program. In this part of the census plan, this is where we also identify and delineate what we call type of enumeration areas. So that's where you get whether people will get something in the mail to respond or whether we'll be enumerating them through some other type of means. So, for example, we have update leave. That's where the Census Bureau actually hand delivers questionnaires to addresses that don't have normal city-style addresses and to areas also affected by natural disasters. So for the 2020 census, for example, we've designated the entire island of Puerto Rico as update leave. We feel that we need to actually go in the field and give them their questionnaires, as well as some areas affected by fires in California and hurricanes and floods like in the Gulf Coast of Florida. We're also leveraging some workload models and technology to effectively manage and route the on-the-ground staff assignments for the address canvassing that is actually happening in the field. As I said, next we motivate people to respond. So this is in two primary areas. We have a nationwide communications and partnership campaign that we're conducting. So we've in the past used paid advertising successfully and some audience segmentation. So we're going to be doing that again in the 2020 census. We'll communicate about the census based on advanced modeling techniques to increase awareness and self-response. And in addition to the traditional print and broadcast media advertising, for the first time, we're able to do some focused segmentation to reach specific audiences through digital advertising. And so that was like the first primary area that we focused to encourage people to respond. The second is, but in many ways more important, is we provide a safe and secure environment and systems where people can submit their self-response and their personal information, and we communicate that their information is safe and confidential. The next step is kind of been the star of the show, getting people to self-respond. So previous censuses asked the public to respond primarily by mail, and sometimes there have been like a mode or two also available. But for the first time, we're really highlighting the internet as the primary response option, and we're really trying to make it easy for people to respond anytime and anywhere. So obviously the internet instrument will be available at any time. The anywhere piece is all of the mailing materials will have a Census ID, so that if you log in with your ID, you can it'll populate with your address and you confirm that you're living at the address that's associated with the ID. But if you're out and about and you see some advertising and you're, oh, I forgot to respond to the census, or maybe you threw away the mailer because maybe you didn't realize that it was important or what it was, and you realize, oh, I haven't responded to the census, there is an option to respond without an ID. It requires on you to put in your address of where you are, but that we've developed that and we've tested it through the mid-decades in order to make it easy for people to respond anywhere that they are. So while we are encouraging people to respond online, we know that's not ideal for everybody. So we do have options for people to respond using the telephone, so they can call and someone will take their census responses, or using paper questionnaires, which still will be sent to housing units. And we have an online questionnaire and the phone will be supporting 13 languages, which is more than we have done in the past. And Marissa will be speaking more about some of those languages and the language research a little bit later. But that's also been a great area of expansion. So as I mentioned, we do have this other type of enumeration for people who live in group quarters. Group quarters are places where people stay in like a group living arrangement, and they're owned or managed by an entity or an organization providing housing or services for the residents. They may include custodial, medical care, maybe other types of assistance, and it's usually restricted, usually the people who live there are people who are receiving those services. So the people who live there are also usually not related to each other. Some common examples are university housing, residential treatment centers, nursing facilities, correctional facilities, hospitals, things like this. So they do have a special enumeration at the same time in order to make sure that we count everybody there. We also have a service-based enumeration to count people experiencing homelessness. People will go to kitchens, shelters, outdoor locations, and try to find the people who may be living in those sorts of areas or be receiving services from those areas. So now getting the responses from people who haven't responded. For the first time, we're using full-scale smartphone technology to capture responses in the field. This is an area that was paper in 2010, so we've transitioned to fully on a handheld device, or a smartphone, actually. So we're taking advantage of some automation to efficiently manage and route the on-the-ground staff. So instead of someone just owning cases and getting their cases done, we're routing them according to when we think the effort would be best spent. So area census offices will rely on automation to collect and manage payroll information, manage the work, enable more efficient case assignment, automatic determination of even optimal travel routes, and reduce the number of actual physical offices. So I want to take a moment to talk about data that people have already provided to the government, which we call administrative records. So we'll be using some data that we get from the U.S. Postal Service, the IRS, Social Security, other agencies in order to remove vacant and or maybe some non-existing addresses that we have from the non-response follow-up workload. And in some cases, we'll use these records to maybe enumerate households that do not respond to the census. So I really want to stress, though, this is when we only do this when we have really high level of confidence that the data for a household is accurate and complete. And if it's not, as is in the case of virtually all traditionally undercounted populations, we'll still send someone to the door to conduct an interview. And I also want to stress that even though we're getting these data from these other agencies, we are never giving data to these other agencies. It's not a reciprocal relationship. But using these administrative records, so these are, again, information that people have already provided to the federal government, it enables us to identify millions of vacant or non-existent housing units and reduces the need and cost of multiple visits and knocks on doors in order to verify these vacant units. We'll also verify the status by when we send the mail. We get these undeliverable as address codes. So if we get multiples of these returns, that's another way that we're identifying vacants. And just so you get a sense for the scale of this, in 2010, vacant and deleted housing units accounted for nearly 30% of the 48 million total workload size for non-response follow-up. And finally, as with prior censuses, we will be delivering apportionment counts to the president and then redistricting counts to the states so that they can redraw their borders for their local and federal offices. So the video was really awesome. It showed that apportionment divides those 435 seats in the House among the 50 states. Redistricting is done by the states themselves with the data, and is the redrawing of those congressional and state legislative districts. We'll also build upon efforts in recent decades to give the public greater access to the data. We're providing flexible tools which allow the public to view 2020 census data any way they want. And improvements will include visualizations, easier search functionality, and improved access to data tables and data sets. Data is not very useful if you can't use it, and we're providing it the public resource. So I mentioned that we provide a secure place for people to respond. We want to ensure that respondent data are safe through our culture of data stewardship. And it's a comprehensive framework designed to protect information over the whole course of the life cycle. So from collection, which we do on encrypted secure devices where the data are stored at rest on the instrument, and then through transmission where the data are transmitted immediately and secured in transit. And then finally, once Census Bureau actually has the data, it would sit inside Census Bureau firewalls, and the data are protected in all the processing stages and through the 2020 disclosure avoidance system, where we assure that the data provided on census forms remains confidential in all census publications. So the design for the 2020 census is, in this arena is a balance of data security and user experience. So our primary focus is on data security. We have multiple physical security techniques to increase security, especially surrounding the means of data collection and data storage.
Keep you guessing, especially on the phone since voice is used here. So this is Marisa again, for everyone that is not in the room. Highlighting a few of the things that Julia talked about, especially motivating people to self-respond. Integrated partnership and communications is a huge component of that. So this is the program that's really engaged with motivating people, preferably via the internet, to respond, and raising the awareness to just encourage response overall throughout the entire 2020 census, including non-response follow-up. So the integrated partnership and communication operation communicates the importance of participating in the 2020 census. And they support everything, like the full life cycle here, from supporting field recruitment efforts, so making sure that we have a really diverse and qualified census workforce, encouraging and engaging and motivating people to self-respond, again, preferably via the internet, and then raising and keeping that awareness high throughout the entire 2020 census to encourage that self-response and a high response rate overall. And then an important thing that Julia talked about is they continue on after the census in supporting the dissemination of the data, so making sure that people know that the data is out there, what's publicly available, how to use it, kind of supporting that effort. So they have 5 major components. They have a website and mobile component, they have media relations, paid advertising, statistics in schools, and social media. And if you're a savvy social media person, there are some business cards out with the other materials where you can follow Census Bureau on our various social media channels. And then the other piece that I want to highlight is the partnership program, which is really central to each of these components. This is a complicated diagram, so I'm going to talk through it. As Julia said, this really is the star of the show. This is our focus on optimizing self-response. So our goal in conducting the 2020 census is to generate the largest possible self-response, because making sure that that self-response rate is really, really high reduces the number of households that then require follow-up, which can be expensive.
along the top hemisphere, so blue hemisphere, if it's showing up blue today, we're motivating everyone by encouraging this self-response. So through micro-targeted advertising, tailoring contact strategies, creating notices that encourage self-response, sending multiple mailings. Local and national partnership program, again, is going to be out there helping us assure everyone that the data are confidential and secure, it's safe to respond online. And then on the bottom part of this diagram here, we want to make sure people know that responding is easier than ever. So the increased use and adaptation of the internet in pretty much all sectors of our life led to the design of an internet option for a 2020 census. So as Julia said, it can be used on home computers, public libraries, public forums. You can use it on your mobile phone. You can use it on your laptop, tablet. There are many ways to reach this technology. So as we're developing this, we ask ourselves questions that might be going through your head. So what about people who don't have access to the internet? What about people who aren't comfortable with technology or just don't want to put their personal information online? And what about people who don't have access to Wi-Fi or electronic devices at all? So we will send a paper questionnaire in the first mailing to some areas that don't have a strong internet connectivity or are otherwise less likely to be using the internet. And in the fourth mailing, so of 5 mailings that we would send, the fourth one will include a paper questionnaire for anyone who hasn't responded at that point yet. We also developed census questionnaire assistance centers, so these are our telephone contact centers, and they support in a number of ways. So people can call and go through kind of an interactive voice system where they can ask a question, get an answer, or they can talk to a human representative, which I know some of us really want to talk to that human. So talk to a human and ask their questions, get support for responding online. Like if you're responding online and stuck on a question, you can call and ask for help with that question. And then the third thing that they can do is actually help people respond on the phone, to actually do that interview over the phone. Okay. So this slide is something that's really near and dear to my heart. It's happening with my staff. So the last thing that you might be wondering is, what about people whose primary language is not English? So our language program this decade is far stronger than it was 10 years ago. So part of this is the introduction of the internet instrument itself. So because we're able to provide the internet questionnaire in 12 languages in addition to English, we can really support a lot more languages during this self-response phase. So for internet, we'll be able to support Spanish, Vietnamese, Korean, Russian, Arabic, Tagalog, Polish, French, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, Japanese. And the added innovation behind this is, unlike in the 2010 census where people had to call someone on the telephone and ask to have a questionnaire in a specific language mailed to them, wait for it to get there, or in some cases they could go out to a center and pick up a questionnaire in another language. This time you get a letter in the mail, you can go online, 10 seconds later, first page, you can toggle the instrument to be in the language that you want, and you're responding right away. Huge innovation. Supporting these 12 languages, we think will support about 87% of limited English-speaking households in the United States. Census questionnaire assistance is going to support the same 12 languages. So, if you're responding in Tagalog and you get stuck on a screen, you can call, talk to somebody who can then support you in Tagalog, which is really nice. And each one of these languages has a separate phone number. That phone number is listed on a language assistance sheet that comes in the mailing with instructions in that language. So then in addition to that, we will provide print and language guides in 59 non-English languages. I'm not going to read them all because it's a lot, which is really exciting for us. So all of these languages are expected to meet about 98% of limited English households in the United States. So add that to English, and it's about 99% of all households overall. And then these guides will also be produced in American Sign Language, Braille, and large print. I want to make sure we mention too. So I mentioned really quickly they're both print and video language guides. So print guide would walk people through how to respond to a paper questionnaire. video guide walks people through how to respond on the internet. And then last but not least, on the right-hand side, we're going to continue providing bilingual mail and field enumeration materials in Spanish. And in some cases, the entire mail package, including the paper questionnaire, will be bilingual in English and Spanish. And this is for those tracts where there's a significant percentage of Spanish-speaking, limited English-speaking households. Switch again. So we're going to move from a topic that near and dear to Maurice's heart to something that's near and dear to my heart, because this is something that my staff work on. So how did we get from the 2010 strategy, where we invite people to self-respond, to the 2020 census strategy? So the 2010 strategy, everyone got at least 3 mailings, potentially 4 if you were in specific areas and didn't respond, or you got an advance letter, then the questionnaire, and then a reminder, and then maybe a replacement questionnaire if you didn't respond and were in specific areas. As Marisa mentioned, we now have multiple strategies. Some people will be getting a paper questionnaire in the first mailing, many people will not. If you don't respond by the 4th mailing, everyone will get a paper questionnaire. And then we have this array of letters and postcards, and they're all coming at different times. And so how did we get from that? Well, the answer is mid-decade research. There were a number of census tests between 2010 and now. We tested, there were some sort of tests in every year beginning in 2012, large and small. I have on here some of the larger tests that we did that I'm going to talk about some of the results which got us to where we are. But some of these tests were site tests, where we chose specific geographic areas that enabled us to learn something about some new thing that we were trying. Some of them were national tests, where we took a large national sample from across the nation in order to make statements, like larger statements. So first I'm going to highlight the things that we found that changed the strategy from 2010 that seemed to work well. So in 2012, we did the national census test. This was a national test. This is actually the first time that we tried the internet after 2010. This is the first time we were able to try this, what we call the internet first strategy, where maybe we didn't give you a questionnaire the very first time that we contacted you. And so, I mean, it looked different in 2012 than what we're doing now, but that start of that strategy seemed to work. We also got rid of the advance letter. It's kind of a different world when you have an internet response option, and it's a different world than saying, hey, we're going to send you something, and then have to wait another few days to get that something if you could just respond online. So even though the 2010 strategy had been well informed by other tests, like previous testing, and also literature, which showed that an advanced contact helped with a paper form, it didn't seem to be especially effective, especially in the world of internet. So after the 2012 test, we got rid of that. We just made the first letter invitation. We also added a second reminder after the first reminder, so if you didn't respond, you would get this additional reminder, and that worked well. The 2015 test, a census test, not the 2015 national content test, so we did a few tests in 2015. The 2015 census test was a site test, and we tried. That was the first time we allowed people to respond without a census ID, which I mentioned, and that definitely worked. So it again, like especially earlier in the decade, as you move through, the form was a little bit different because we were able to change it as we went through the decade. So the way that we asked people to do that has a little bit different since 2015, but the core is still there. You can respond without providing a census ID. The 2015 national content test was large. We had a sample of 1.2 million housing units. We did a lot of tinkering there. So we found from that a fifth mailing, a fifth final mailing of, we call it a not too late postcard. After we send out that final census questionnaire, the paper questionnaire, in case you didn't get it before and you were waiting for it, or if you did get it before and you just didn't respond, you get another one. Having one more reminder after that saying you can still respond, that worked. Sending the first reminder, so after the initial invitation, we have a reminder a little bit sooner. So instead of a week after, a few days after the initial reminder, increased response rates. This, even though we've been working on an internet choice strategy, like when the mailing should be sent, to whom, 2015 national content test was where we really found what seemed to be working, like the areas that, the types
to be focusing on and when exactly, how the mailing should go. We also did some testing with bilingual materials. So there's a couple of different, well, first we found that you should send bilingual materials. That helped with response rates, which was the main finding. So we also tested how you present the two languages on paper forms or paper letters, whether it's the two languages side by side, what we call the swim lane version, versus one side has one language and the other side has the other language. So we tested both in 2015. The 2016 census test was a site test. We found on there changing the reminder postcard to reminder letter worked well, and having the census ID actually printed on the letter instead of on an insert with the letter also worked fine. And then so there's less testing as you go along, because the earlier decade was more on let's try all these things, and the later decade is let's really focus on getting these things down pat. So in the 2018 census end-to-end census test, we didn't really do a lot of testing, but that is where we found that cohorts, which is the division of this very large self-response universe at the beginning, into these more manageable chunks of I think in 2018 was 3, where it spreads out the mailing load for our mailer, and so they don't have to mail to 140 million housing units all in one go, but maybe over a couple of weeks spreading out that load. And then also spreading out the load on our internet self-response application, so that you don't suddenly get millions of people trying to respond at the same day. We found that we were able to operationalize that in 2018, so and it gets you to where we are now. But I want to show you the things that we tried that we decided not to move forward with for different reasons. The 2014 census test was a site test as well. We tried sending email reminders. That didn't really seem to get us a lot. We also tried something called pre-registration twice. We tried that in 2014 and 2015, where we invited people like, hey, do you want to know when the census is coming? Like, come sign up. That did not seem to really get us a boost in response rates. The 2015 National Content Test also tried never sending a questionnaire, still sending letters, and obviously telling people they could respond online, but just never sending them a paper questionnaire. That was not found to be successful. So these are overall response results. The Census Bureau also needs to ensure that whole groups of people are not missed due to our methods of inviting response. That's primarily why we developed these two context strategies, and we evaluated the results throughout the decade by demographic groups in order to make sure that what we decided was working for everybody. So I just want to talk about the questionnaire itself. Mid-decade, we tested some changes to the questionnaire. Rather than going over all the things that we tested, I thought we could focus on one question to see kind of how it went from 2010 to 2020. So let's talk about the relationship question. Here you see how it looked in 2010. The question is straightforward. It's asked, how is this person related to person 1? So this is asked only for person 2+. We don't ask this. Mark X one box. The response options included specific related and unrelated relationship categories, and then there are 2 general other response options, other relative or other non-relative. And due to space constraints on the paper form, response options were double banked. The 2015 National Content Test experimentally tested the expansion of the husband or wife and unmarried partner response options so that respondents could indicate if the couple that they're talking about are of opposite sexes or the same sex. This is done because we wanted to reduce the measurement error for reporting on same-sex couple households. Due to the relative sizes of the populations, a very small mismark rate in the sex question of opposite-sex couple households can greatly inflate the reporting of same-sex couple households overall. So if as in previous censuses we have done, if we were to rely on the counts of same-sex households, if we were to create the counts of same-sex households by relying on both the sex and relationship questions. So these response options were added in order to reduce measurement error, and the analysis after the 2015 National Content Test showed no differences in either non-response rates or the distribution of coupled households. So here you see the question as it will look in the 2020 census. So we kept those categories. I've also highlighted this category roommate or housemate. If you will notice in 2010 and 2015, there are a couple of categories that you could use to describe these relationships. There's housemate or roommate and roomer or boarder. In the 2016 census test, we experimented with removing one or both of those and seeing how people would respond, use these non-related to household categories or other non-relatives or whatever categories were left in the experimental version. And the findings from that test, the 2016 census test, supported some previous qualitative findings that the roomer or boarder category doesn't really respond or resonate with respondents, I should say. So there are a few other accomplishments of note. So here you can see our timeline from 2018 to 2021. As I mentioned earlier, we have this local update of census addresses operation, and the submission phase concluded on December 15th of 2018, and we received over 8,000 submissions, and 6,857 included changes, and 1,542 had no changes. And those submissions, as I mentioned, covered over 95% of housing units and 95% of the population. So our geography division is now processing those submissions, seeing what needs to be done to our frame and what needs to be done in data collection. In January 23rd, we also completed the mail-out via email of the boundary and annexation survey invitation letters to tribal, state, and local governments. And there are webinars that have been conducted with those governments earlier this year. And this is an opportunity for tribal, state, and local governments to the legal boundaries, names, and governmental statuses of their jurisdictions. And we began production in our Decennial Logistics Center in Jeffersonville, on track to open 2 paper data capture centers, one in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and one in Phoenix, Arizona, for all those paper forms that we will be getting back for sure, even though we are pushing the internet response option. And we're well on our way to opening our questionnaire assistance contact centers, which are the means by which Marisa mentioned people can call for help or maybe even to self-respond if they like in any number of languages. Well, actually, no, any of 13 languages, I should say. And we're progressing towards our goal of opening all 10 sites by July 1st. So thank you again for your time. This concludes the presentation, and I hope you found it informative. So feel free to connect with us. I'll be and I'll take some questions first. Happy to have some questions.
There's a lot of them.
Okay.
All right.
Whichever one will work with first.
Let's start with some any audience questions first, and then we'll switch over to the phone.
Hi, Madeline Milcott. I watched some of the CSAC meeting last week, and I can't say the name. Gina, somebody said that complex households who share custody need to coordinate enumeration. If the mailing
there are a number of different things that will support these unique situations. So the mailings themselves, we'll talk about making sure that everyone is counted. So we do address like the potential of, especially children, being one of those groups that might be difficult to count or difficult to include in the right place. So in our letters, we will say things like make sure we count all adults, children, and babies. But it does not go into the kind of details that I think you're asking for. That detail is going to be more for people that have those kinds of questions. If they call the telephone, the Census questionnaire assistance, those are the kind of questions that they'll be able to support, kind of more of those unique situations. We do want to keep the mailings tight, so people aren't having to read several pages. Does that answer your question? Okay.
All right, we'll do one more from the audience.
Is it green?
want to repeat it again, if you don't mind, sir?
Sure. What experience has Census found about people's assessment of how safe and confidential are when they enter them online?
Yeah, that's a good question. So,
there have been a lot of just saying we treat you.
So the Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators survey that I think was probably being presented by Gina Willico at CSAC touched on a number, like as the name suggests, on a number of reasons why people respond or don't, or why they would say that they respond or don't, because that was just conducted last year, and obviously they haven't responded at that point. And that included a mail-out survey as well as some focus groups. So in order especially to get to these populations that smaller from our size of measures, survey can't really get to. So I believe they did ask about questions like that, and that was one of the is one of the barriers for people to respond, but among many others. So I would see more about what we got from that. But that is why we are sending paper questionnaires still. We're not on a that's why we're not totally online only.
I'll take two of the questions that are coming in from our webinar folks, and then we'll return to the room. So we have one webinar participant asking, how is Census addressing gender? Are additional options being included, such as transgender male or transgender female?
I'll take that one. It's just for anybody who's curious about exactly which questions we're planning to ask on the 2020 census. There is a document on our website. So if you go to census.gov and look for the questions planned, it's a joint document, so it talks about both 2020 census questions and the American Community Survey questions, so you can actually see how they'll be laid out and what they'll ask. So we do have a sex question that asks, what is this person's sex? We don't have a current request for sexual orientation or gender identity. Part of that is that the federal agencies must request the data and have a statutory or regulatory need for the data, and we just don't have a current request for that question right now.
All right, I'll take one more from the webinar. We have someone asking if there were some tests of alternative ways to ask about race and ethnicity, and what was ultimately decided. So again, this is another specific question. You can speak to that.
Sure. So the Census Bureau follows the Office of Management and Budget Race and Ethnicity Standards. So at this point, more research and testing is needed before we can proceed to implement or propose any changes to that question. But the Census Bureau will continue to further its extensive research on how to collect accurate race and ethnicity data across its surveys.
We'll take one more from the audience, and we'll get back around.
I was just wondering, what's the rule for non-response follow-up? You have to get 100% response, and you have to keep following up, or you could stop at 99% response, and then one person could be either imputed, or you can use sample model or something like that, because I know there's a statutory requirement.
Thank you. So to be clear, we don't do any sampling in the enumeration of people. So non-response follow-up is an effort to get to 100% enumeration. That is not feasible from a monetary perspective. So everybody, there is an attempt to follow up with all non-responders, but as I mentioned, since we have some good quality data from administrative records, there is some modeling to indicate like how much additional effort each housing unit needs, and that's how case assignment feeds into case assignment, and just if the case should still be out there for enumeration. So there isn't like a goal other than 100% that we're trying to hit. It really is. We start with all of the possible housing units that are left that haven't responded, and we base off and the quality of the administrative records that we have for housing units, how much effort should be.
My main question to physical is, like, 100% unresponsive. What happens, like, 0.02%? How are you going to fill that gap?
Oh, what happens after non-response follow-up? Okay.
How are you going to fill that
yeah.
gap? Is it imputation or model?
We do, as I said, we do use administrative records where we can. There is an imputation process for when we don't get responses, or maybe potentially some item non-response on items. There is imputation.
I watched most of the National Press Club briefing this morning, and I can't remember if it was Director Dillingham or Tim Olson who talked about using non-ID processing to enumerate residents on the spot. And I'm sure they weren't talking about enumerators with an iPhone. It sounded as if somebody from, say, philanthropy or a local government or some partner would pigeonhole the person and say, oh, you haven't been enumerated? Please get your phone out and self-respond right now. Is that what they were talking? Having people in the field other than enumerators pigeonhole.
So non-ID processing, or when they're talking about non-ID, that's kind of what Julia was referring to earlier, where if you have your census ID and it came in the mail, you can go online, enter that census ID, it's connected to your address, or your address shows, you verify that that is indeed where you live. There is also a process where if you don't have your ID, you can still respond. So it's kind of getting over that barrier if maybe you're at an event and someone has convinced you, like, yes, I really should respond to the 2020 census. I have to go home, and I have to figure out where I put my ID, and where did I file it, and if it's too much effort, maybe I'll just say, oh, never mind. But if I can do it right now, and I'm engaged, there is that option to just go ahead, and if you don't know what your ID is, you can still do your response while it's, like, really top of mind for you. And you can do non-ID from anywhere, is I think what he was getting at.
Thanks.
I was wondering, how do you keep people from using somebody else's address or ID?
So the IDs are in the mailed materials. So in order to use someone else's ID, you'd have to get someone else's mail, which that's the problem outside of the census. So we do so non-ID that could lead to multiple responses for the same housing unit, which I think is maybe that's the question. So we already know that happened in previous censuses. We can get multiple responses. We had multiple nodes in previous censuses. So there is a process to adjudicate between responses from the same multiple responses from the same housing unit, so that there's only one response representing a given housing unit. And there are, I should also touch on, which we didn't really hear, there's, we do it, online presents new challenges with fraudulent activities, and there is a operation that is completely set up to detect fraudulent activities and monitor the responses as they're coming in.
I'll ask one question from the webinar audience that's kind of along the same lines, dealing with confidentiality. And this person is asking about how is the Census Bureau assuring the confidentiality of personal responses to the extent the Bureau is outsourcing processing to third-party vendors.
So a lot of the information that will be in the mailings will address this specifically. We have a legal mandate. We're required by law to protect respondents' confidentiality. And then there are additional responsibilities on top of that, like there's a Federal Cybersecurity Act of 2015. I'm not going to get that name right. I'll have to go find it later. But there are a lot of responsibilities on top of that where the systems have responsibilities that information safe. We as an agency have this legal mandate to keep everyone's responses confidential, and all of those things kind of nicely dovetail with a lot of systems that aren't really appropriate to talk about in this context, but we're working really hard to keep everything, whether it's online or it's coming through the mail or it's over the phone, as confidential as it can possibly be.
We did have one other question from online about summarizing the findings from the bilingual materials test. This is swim lanes versus front and back. If you had any thoughts on that you wanted to share.
Sure. Like I said, we found that sending bilingual was better than having no bilingual. And the results for swim lane versus front and back we didn't really find a lot of differences in the testing that we did, so we went with front and back.
So my question is also about optimizing self-response. You mentioned that some group of people would receive a second mailing if the population was in an area with low internet service, or if people were less likely to respond to the first mailing. My question is, how do you determine that characteristic of the group of people?
So we're using data from the American Community Survey, mode preferences, especially from the American Community Survey of areas from the American, not a specific housing, it's from the American Community Survey, as well as FCC data about internet connections, and age is another element of that. So we combine these measures to come up with a measure that we use to determine if an area should get this internet first, where you don't get the questionnaire until the fourth mailing, versus an area that we think really needs a paper questionnaire.
Develop two sets of non-response follow-up procedures, because I can imagine the types of procedures and reasons that they may try to give individuals to respond would differ depending upon what the questionnaire looks like.
There were a few questions in there. I'm trying to make sure that I get them all.
So are they having to say, here's the non-response follow-up? Greater resistance or follow.
Okay, I'm going to answer just a couple different ways, try to get a couple different pieces of that. So non-response follow-up kind of being at the end of the process, it's the people that haven't already elected to self-respond. So likely there is a reason. It could be a lack of familiarity with the census. It could be concerns about confidentiality. It could be a number of different things. So the field staff that will be enumerating those households will have to be really well versed in all of the potential concerns so that they can really open a dialogue with those households. And it could be any number of things, regardless of what the content of the questionnaire is. There could just be concerns. On top of, just people being busy and having a lot of demands on their time, and, maybe at this point they'll be watching the Olympics, and, with
probably.
The events were just so exciting, we couldn't get to it. So there's that piece of it, but we also know that people are concerned about confidentiality, regardless of section itself is a concern. A lot of people will potentially have concerns about the questions that are on the questionnaire. So a big piece of the non-response follow-up enumerator's job and kind of all of this staff's job is going to be really emphasizing that point about keeping everyone's answers confidential.
Okay, last call. Questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, and please join me in saying thank you to our speakers. We do have a small token of appreciation. You get a coffee mug each with WSS on it. And we'd also like to thank BLS for letting us host the event in the conference room. We welcome everyone to join us following the talk at an informal reception across the street at the 8th Street Cafe. If you walk just across the street, enter Union Station, you go up the escalators, they go right turn to the H&M over on the right side, and then you go up another set of escalators, and East Street Cafe is kind of in the back. They're expecting a group, so please come and join us. Food and beverage are available for purchase. If there are any other questions, you're welcome to discuss with the speakers afterwards, and please make sure that you signed in when you joined us here today. All right, thanks everyone.